So I've tested the Duo now for over a month, and it's time for me to give you my review, what I think of this camera now that I've had a good bit of experience with it. Now I know what everyone's biggest question is. Does it guide through narrowband filters? This is the narrowband channel, so yes, of course, that is one of the things that I tested out. And I could say that, yeah, in complete summary, it works, okay? It really does work. Just about everybody is going to be able to find this thing usable with narrowband filters. I've tested this thing with 3 different scopes. My 61 Sharp Star, my 122mm SV Bony, and then finally I tested it in my 8-inch Newtonian. And I tried it at varieties of different f-stops, and I also have done it, you know, underneath my sky under a variety of different lighting conditions. And I actually was able to simulate light pollution by kind of testing it during the twilight hours rather than waiting for it to be completely dark. I live under a Bortle 4 sky, and most of you don't. So basically, by shooting during twilight through many of these tests, I was able to test during Bortle 7 and Bortle 8 type conditions. Also, I did a lot of these tests during a full moon. You know, I don't think I did a single one of these tests on anything less than 87% illumination of the moon. Now, the other thing that I did was I chose a very challenging target, and that's M13. Now, M13 is a globular cluster. It's a big one, it's a bright one, but it's also outside of our Milky Way. I think it actually hovers about 10,000 light years above our galaxy, so to speak. And because of that, there really aren't very many bright stars around it. So that's one of the reasons why I chose this very challenging target. Now, the filter that I use is a 6.5 nanometer dual band narrowband filter. It has an 82% transmission rate on O3 and about 90% transmission on hydrogen alpha. It's actually a little bit more of an economical filter, 6.5 nanometers dual band. Now, a lot of you are going to be using narrower filters than that, and if you're wondering, okay, well, how's it going to perform with, let's say, a 3 nanometer filter? A 3 nanometer filter is probably going to pass half as much light as my filter does. So basically, if you look at my test results, which I'm going to go over with you now, with each and every single rig, if it's able to guide at f10, then you should be able to guide with those performance scenarios and those shutter speeds at, let's say, f5, because you'll begin getting, well more than twice as much light. Actually, you should be able to do it at about f7 even, because that's about 1 stop better. Now, once again, I am going to kind of harangue the skeptics who were wildly off. I mean, a lot of people said that this camera would completely not work with narrowband filters, and they were wrong. Like, once again, you gotta remember, guys, this is a difference of technology by 20 years, okay? It's a big difference. So keep it in mind, and let's start going over each of my rigs. This guy right here is actually one I probably spent the largest amount of time testing behind. I tested it when it was truly dark out. I'm underneath the Bortle 4 sky. I tested it during twilight hours when the sky background brightness was equal to that of about a Bortle 7, Bortle 8 sky. And actually, surprisingly enough, the difference in the number of stars that I was able to get was very minimal between the two. But then again, you know, we're shooting through a dual band narrowband filter, which is pretty narrow at 6.5 nanometers. So I can kind of see why, you know, twilight and light pollution really isn't going to be a major factor. So those of you who are wondering, well, what about my sky where I live? I think you should actually kind of write that off really as any kind of consideration at all. It's not really going to be a major factor if you're using a dual band narrowband filter. And if you're not using a dual band narrowband filter, you're shooting broadband, well, I mean, obviously you have nothing to worry about either. So, but this is kind of one of my favorite setups, by the way. I really like getting this guy out. Although my AM5 is really kind of competing with this guy a little bit. Why I like it is because it's so light, it's so easy to set up, and it just works very nicely. It has a nice wide field of view, and therefore there's a lot of stuff that I can image with it. Now right now I have the 1600 on here, but basically the 1600 just came off along with the filter wheel, and this guy screwed in place, and I also put a dual band narrowband filter in it, of course. And yes, I did remove the guide scope that was up there. Actually, as I was setting the thing up, I even kind of had to like stop and like, wait a minute, I don't need that. So I removed it to kind of lighten this thing up. One of the things that I did is I printed these masks. What these do is they allow me to stop the scope down, so to speak, so that I could basically simulate instances where those of you who have like a smaller scope with really a slower speed, because this guy is quite fast. He's f4.5. And something else to note is that the Duo, the guide sensor is actually mounted quite a ways away from the central axis of the image circle. And because of that, well, we're kind of outside of the image circle of this here scope, which is actually something that was actually kind of a concern for a lot of you. Well, what about scopes that are smaller or that don't support a 35mm image circle? Now, I know this scope, the manufacturer does claim that this will support a 35mm sensor, but I will tell you right now that is not the case. If you do put a 35mm sensor on this scope, you're gonna get disappointed by the results, let's put it that way. The image circle is just big enough, really, just barely for an APS-C size sensor, which is actually what this guy has. So it's actually a pretty good fit to it. But that guide sensor, which is outside of the main image circle and is in an area where the stars were kind of misshaped, yes, yeah, that was pretty obvious. When I was looking at the stars in the guide software, they were definitely misshaped. They were not round at all at f4.5. Here's the interesting thing though. When I started stopping the scope down, some aspects of my guiding actually started to improve because the stars got rounder as I started stopping the scope down. Now, I tried a variety of different apertures. I did f6, which right away at f6, I was able to guide with 4-second exposures. I tested 2-second exposures, I tested 1-second exposures, I tested half-second exposures, and yes, I even tested 2/10 second exposures and was still able to guide just fine. With 2/10 second exposures, I think I had 3 stars to guide on. And keep in mind, this is M13 we're talking about, so there are no bright stars in this area. Next, I switched to f7. Now at f7, when I got down to 2/10 of a second, I only had 1 star that I could guide on. But that's okay, you know. I mean, most of you aren't going to guide at shutter speed that fast anyways. And of course, you know, I tested it 4 seconds, 2 seconds, 1 second, half second, and so forth. I tested every single major shutter speed between 4 seconds and half a second with all of the different apertures that I did with all of the different scopes. And here's an interesting thing that I kind of learned in this process, and I actually kind of already knew this, but I hadn't really tested it, and that's that your mount will kind of like a certain shutter speed. And this guy, believe it or not, he liked either 4-second exposures or half-second exposures. Those are the kind of 2 playing fields that, you know, he liked the best. Yes, I went down f8, and at f8 at half-second exposures, yes, I was still able to guide. I still had, I think it was 2 guide stars at that. Of course, at 1 second, I think I had 6, and then at 2 seconds, you know, I had more than 12. Now, at f10, that tiny little hole, yes, even at f10, I could guide and with a half-second exposure. Okay. So, and I think at f10, it liked 1-second exposures the best, but it also liked 4-second exposures. At least that's what my mount kind of liked. You know, and what your mount likes and what it kind of responds to, like the frequency of your exposures, is kind of something you just kind of need to experiment with. So yeah, that's the Sharp Star. That's how this thing will guide with a miniature little telescope. If you are using a 3nm, then basically you can take my performance at f7, and that right there is kind of what you can expect, because that's basically half the light from f10, or twice as much light from f10. All right, so here's another scope that I tried this eye on. This is a brand new scope from SC Bony. It's their newest, it's kind of their flagship refractor. It's their 122 millimeter. It's f7, and I used it with the focal reducer, with field flattener, at f5.6. Now, this guy was probably the easiest one to use this camera with, because we had every single scenario that I could throw at it, it was flawless. And of course, one of the major reasons for that is because it has such a big image circle. It definitely would probably support a 35mm sensor. It might have a little bit of distortions around the edges, and you might need to do some flats to, you know, with this here kind of scope, but you know, this isn't about the scope, this is about the camera. How did it perform? Naturally, I used it at f5.6, that's where I initially tested it, and yes, I was able to guide even with exposures down to half a second. Now, when I started throwing the aperture mask on here, because I did make 2 aperture masks for it, I made an aperture mask that would take it down to f8, and then another one that would take it down to f10, and yes, even at f10 and at f8, I was able to work with 4-second exposures, 2-second exposures, 1-second exposures, and half-second exposures just fine. Now, at half-second exposures at f10, I think I only had about 3 or 4 stars, but it was actually a little bit more than the sharp star was. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that this guy is corrected all the way out to the edge of a 35mm sensor quite well. And I don't have it on the mount. I used the AM5 mount. Right now I've got another telescope on there, which I was actually testing last night with the dual band. Now, if you're wondering how I focused this thing, it was pretty simple. All I did was focused for the imaging sensor, and that's the one that I did the autofocusing on. And then I just turned the knob here until stars kind of somewhat got sharp. I didn't hugely stress about focus of the actual guiding sensor. I'm actually kind of a believer of having your guide sensor just slightly out of focus. And this guy right here, actually, I had the guide sensor the most out of focus of all of the different telescopes that I tried. Actually, I don't think I even touched it from the factory coming in. Now, with a sharp star, I definitely did tweak that focus a little bit, as I also did with my Newtonian, which is the next telescope that we'll talk about. For my Newtonian, this guy was actually the one that I was kind of worried about the most. The coma corrector that I have, this is a Botter 2-inch coma corrector. It only has a 42mm pass-through zone. And really, it's probably 40mm. But yeah, in order to get this guy to work, or at least to attach the duo, I had to put a step-up ring going from 42 to 48mm, and then a 48 to 54mm step-up ring. So yeah, there are 2 step-up rings stacked together in order to make this connection happen. Now, this is the last scenario that I kind of tested the duo on, and actually I did this test last night under a 95% illuminated moon, and I did not actually get to do this at twilight. However, I mean, at this point, like I said, I kind of tested it with the other 2 scopes, and I didn't find any difference in guiding quality between guiding when it was twilight and, you know, the backgrounds of the sky was still kind of bright because of the sun over the horizon, and, you know, guiding at night when it was dead dark. So anyways, this is my setup on the AM5, which this mount was also used with the 122mm refractor we just saw a second ago. And this is my 1000mm focal length f5 Newtonian. Now, this is an f5. From the factory, it's an f4.9. I actually reduced the aperture just slightly because the edges of the mirrors were a little bit wonky. And this refractor is also about 20 years old and has never been recoated. Really, it functions like about an f7 refractor, if you want to think about it that way. So that's kind of the aperture, if you will, that we are working with this scope, because, you know, over the past 20-something plus years that I've had this scope, aluminum coatings, they deteriorate and they become less reflective with time. f7 is what we're working with. I didn't bother making any, you know, stop down aperture mask for this scope because I just wanted to test it with one scenario. Now, like I said, the coma corrector for this guy, it's only a 42mm circle. And I wasn't really expecting it to work very well, but it actually worked pretty flawlessly. At half-second exposures, I was able to get, surprisingly, 2 stars very consistently. There was a third one that kind of came in and out a few times. Now, at 1 second, of course, I think I had 5 stars, and at 2 seconds, you know, I had a dozen or more, okay? And 4 had plenty. Focusing with this wasn't too bad, just like the other guys. And yes, I was using the 2.5nm filter in here as well. So this is a 1000mm focal length, f5, but really it's like an f7. And yeah, once again, it worked, okay? So yeah, the guiding just works. Now at the end of this video, I'm going to show you some pictures that I've taken with the first 2 scopes. I didn't take any images with this one last night because, well, it clouded over by the time I got done with my guiding tests. Would I buy this camera? Okay, like is this camera going to make me switch from my hardcore all mono fleet? You know, I have a fleet of mono cameras now, except for one. That's the Orion G21, which is a one-shot killer as well. And I got to say that I've used this thing quite a bit. I've taken quite a few photos with it, and it certainly does a great job. You know, the new 2600 series of sensors, I'm really kind of wanting one, okay? Now that I have a 122mm SV Bony Apple, it has a nice big image circle that will support APS-C easily. Yeah, I kind of really want an APS-C sensor. That wider field of view that this thing has is nice. However, I gotta say though that after using the one-shot killer for a little while, I've kind of gotten a little bit bored with it, just because, you know, with a dual band narrowband filter, you're working with HOO. And HOO, it's kind of boring. I mean, you're kind of limited on the targets that you can shoot. Of course, maybe me saying that I got bored taking images with this thing is because it made imaging kind of so easy. There was a couple images that I did that I just wasn't really quite happy with, because typically with a mono camera I would use some other filters and be able to kind of feather in some other types of lighting to bring out some details that I just wasn't possible with a one-shot killer camera. And I know for a fact that ZWO is working on a mono version of this camera, and that one I will definitely be very interested in. But this guy, I'm not going to buy it. I'm going to let it pass. I'll probably send it back here to ZWO. We'll see when they want it back from me, or if they want me to do any more testing to it. I'm going to ask them about that first before I send it back. But yeah, that's kind of my thinking, that, you know, I found myself very quickly bored because it's not a mono camera and I don't have the flexibility that comes with a mono sensor. And also, you don't have the sheer light gathering power of that mono sensor. You know, the resolution of it's great. You know, the files are nice and big and everything. Still not quite as good as a mono camera. It's interesting because I'm really able to get about the same amount of resolution using my 294mm Bind 2x2, which is about 11 megapixel camera, as I can with this guy. And that's because this guy is using the Bayer pattern to form an image. And that gives you kind of, in a lot of ways, about a 9x9 pixel blur. So, you know, it's like you're shooting at bin 3 with a mono camera. So yeah, there's my kind of, you know, I'm still hardcore narrowband guy, mono all the way. That's my opinion. So who do I think that this camera is aimed for? A couple things. Number one, those of you with really big scopes. Really big scopes, having a second guide scope isn't that practical because it starts to add more weight up, and also you get flexure and so forth with those really big scopes. That's kind of who this guy is aimed at. The little Sharp Star, of course, it is actually really fun to use it. It's simple to use, so in a lot of respects, I think people who are just getting into the hobby, who are fairly new, you know, this thing does really make setting up easy. And for me to switch from one scope to the next to the next was something that took sometimes as little as 10 minutes for me to swap all the wires out and swap the camera out and everything. You know, it was really effortlessly easy to set this camera up. So if you're a beginning budding astrophotographer and you're not ready to jump into mono just yet, this is a great camera for you, okay? And as long as you've got, you know, a faster scope, you know, really anything f7 or faster, you're going to be fine using just about any filter that you could possibly want to use. For the hardcore guys that are a little more advanced, well, like I said earlier, I'm going to wait for the mono version. Now, about that mono version, I know when I talked to some of the engineers that were at NEAF and everything, they had mentioned that they were contemplating maybe developing a filter wheel or some sort of filter mechanism that would not obscure the guide sensor. But I haven't, although I just recently talked to one of them again, like just a week or two ago via email, and she said that, you know, they haven't mentioned anything about it for a while, so maybe that isn't going to actually materialize. Now, there is another thing though that could happen. Well, let's go to the whiteboard for this one. So in stacking the images, one of the things I noticed is that one-shot color, it's not really any different in stacking a mono sensor. I use ASTAP for most of my stacking, at least with the mono cameras, and there's no difference in the amount of time. Post-processing though with a one-shot color it's actually a lot more difficult than mono. With mono you just have such beautiful data that is so perfect. But let's talk about the hypothetical mono sensor that we know ZWO is working on. All right, and right now there's a filter, there's a window over the sensors, and I believe it's a UV IR cut filter. So it has a transmission spectrum that looks like this. Okay, you know, with red being all the way over here, infrared, and then ultraviolet, and then of course blue and green here in the middle. Now, what would be interesting though is that we actually got a mono version that had two different types of glass over the two sensors. So the guide sensor would have basically a completely open window. In other words, there would be no cutoff whatsoever. It would be open to the infrared and the ultraviolet, which I'll draw a miniature graph over here. You know, it's basically, its transmission spectrum would look like that, where it's just a clear piece of glass, and ultraviolet and infrared. And then on top of that, we would put our main narrowband filter, and that narrowband filter would have to kind of look like something like this. So ultraviolet once again, here's the infrared, where it would actually have an opening here, and the ultraviolet be mostly closed off. Let's say it had its little spike here for HA, and then maybe over here in the ultraviolet, the transmission spectrum actually opened up again. With a filter like this, basically over the imaging sensor, if you sandwich this one and this one together, it would only allow the hydrogen alpha through, but it would block the infrared and the ultraviolet with the UV IR cut filter that's over the main imaging sensor. Whereas the guiding sensor, because it would be a completely open piece of glass, it would actually be able to detect all of this right here and all of this right here, which would give it plenty of light to guide by. That was something that's actually been proposed on the forums too in Cloudy Nights, and it was an idea that I came up with too. I'm not going to say that I was the first one to do it, but I came up with it on my own. We'll see if ZWO maybe implements something like this. This would be really cool, because, you know, this would bring a mono sensor, because I think a mono sensor, this would be tougher, because with a one-shot color camera, usually using a dual band narrow band filter, which means you have two spikes, so you have twice as much light. Whereas with a single band pass filter, like a hydrogen alpha filter, or an oxygen 3 filter, or an S2 filter, over a mono sensor, well, that you're only going to have one single spike of light, and that I think will be a little bit more challenging. It still would probably work with typical off-the-shelf filters, but I think maybe a solution is kind of similar to something like this, if I'm explaining it right, would actually be really awesome. And with today's filter technology, this is totally possible. There's one thing that I've heard people talk about with the larger ZWO cameras, and that is that there's frost that will build up in the windows, which I've always thought was a little bit ironic because I have never once experienced this with any of the smaller ZWO cameras. Now that I have one of these bigger ZWO cameras, I have in fact experienced frost building up in the window. Now, this guy has a built-in heater though that will actually heat the glass up, and trust me, you have to use it. It has to be going, has to be on, otherwise it will frost up. It's just a guaranteed thing. Now, I was thinking about it. I was like, well, okay, why is it I've never had a problem with the older cameras? Well, you know, I was looking at some of the thermal aspects of these guys. These guys use a Peltier cooler to basically cool the sensor. Okay, and what it does is it takes heat from one side, it transfers it to the other. And in doing that, it heats up these fan blades here. Now, with the older ones, not only did it heat up these blades, but it also transfers it to this neck right here, which actually heats up the glass with the older cameras. The bigger ones don't do that for some reason. There's actually like a separation somehow between the glass and this heat cooling. So with the bigger guys, you absolutely have to turn on the heater. And ZW, if you're listening, I hope you in firmware actually change this to an automatic, it's already on kind of thing, because you know, you've got to turn it on. From the ground up, this really is a different camera than all the previous generation of ZWO cameras. And when I was looking at it over closely, not only did I notice very subtle differences in every single component for the machining, you know, they are using a completely new CAD file and CAD CAM system in their CNC machines to cut these things out. So at least the metal hardware in this thing is quite different. Also, I want you to know that the motherboard in this has been updated. It used to be ZWO cameras had a 256 megabyte buffer. Now they have a 512, which is why this guy is able to actually shoot at a higher frame rate relative to the other 2600 MCs that were not duos in the past. Now, and one other thing, okay, we got to talk about fan vibrations, okay, because this guy does have a big fan in it. And I know some people have been expressing concerns about this, and some people are getting all upset because ZWO hasn't done anything about this yet. Well, I want you to know that the Duo now has a suspended fan in it. You know, if you look inside of this thing very closely, I immediately noticed that the fan is actually held in a little rubber cage where if there is any kind of fan oscillation or noise from the fan, they will be dampened out, of course, by those rubber suspension system. Now, I've used about 5 different ZWO cameras. I have never had an issue with fan vibrations. I talked to another buddy of mine, he's got 6 cameras. He's never had a problem with it. I talked to another buddy of mine, he's got 4 cameras. He's never had a problem with it. I really think that the guys that are raising a hullabaloo about these fan vibrations, they probably just got a bad fan. You know, if a bearing or something like that goes bad in a fan, just replace the fan. It's like a, what, $3 part off of eBay? Yeah. Sometimes people just make a big mess about something that, you know, it's a mountain out of a molehill, let's put it that way. You know, they will swallow a camel, but they will choke on a gnat. Anyways, if you're worried about that, you can now relax. ZWO's got you covered. Even if you had a bad fan, okay, and it starts making all sorts of noise, the vibrations will not hurt your imaging session. Though I still think you should just replace the fan. The camera does come with completely new packaging. This right here is kind of an example of what the older packaging looked like. Pretty rudimentary. You know, your camera came with something like that with all the different accessories and so forth that it comes with. And usually it came with a little padded case. Now the new one, it's got basically 2 compartments on each side, and then you have this little windowed box that actually has the camera in it, along with the little camera case. And the biggest thing of all that I'm really the most excited about is the new cables that they're now shipping with. So you're going to get 2 cables. The 2 smaller cables, they're black. Those are more for like focusers and filter wheels and so forth. And then they give you two of these, two different lengths, a short one and a long one. This is the longer one. And they are nice, heavy duty cables. I know I've had a lot of guys complain to me about having cables fail them in the past. And I've had that happen, but they were cables that I cut and resoldered together, so can't really blame ZWO for that. But yeah, the new cables are definitely beastly. This guy comes with M54 rings. And a lot of scopes aren't M54, so you're probably going to need an adapter. Now, it does come with this guy. This is a step-down ring, or step-up ring, depends on how you're using it. And it has a 48mm inside thread, and then a 54mm outside thread. So, the way I attached it to my scope is I threaded it on like that. First, you're going to want to thread it on. Now, when you thread it on, there's actually two little grooves. Make sure those are facing outwards. That way, if you take the camera off and this thing stays on here, you actually have something to grab and you can loosen it up again. Because if it was to stay inside of the 16.5mm ring, that wouldn't be a big deal because you could actually just reach from the other side with a spanner wrench and pop it out that way. So yeah, that right there is how I thread it on. Put that guy on first and then screw on the camera. It's pretty simple back focus. Of course, I'm not using anything. The 21mm plus the 16.5mm, and then the camera has 17.5mm of back focus into it. All that combined equals 55. Pretty easy to figure out. I had no problems with back focus with any of the scopes that I used. Surprisingly, a lot of people struggle with this part of the hobby. I don't know why. There are very simple technical drawings out there on ZWO's website. If you just Google ZWO camera back focus, they give you a image and diagram of every single scenario that you could possibly do. So I encourage you to look at those and make sure you have it right. You know, don't complain that, you know, the camera's sensitive to back focus, because it's not really. I mean, it's just, you just follow the right setup, put the right pieces in there, and voila, it will work. Probably going to take down the Newtonian and put this guy back on here. In kind of final conclusion, I'll show you a couple images right after here that I've taken with this camera, with both the Sharp Star and this 122mm Apple. And yeah, I've had a lot of fun with this camera. It was really kind of cool to test out a piece of beta hardware. And this camera, it is, I think when I first got this camera, I was one of 4 people who had this camera and have been able to test it and try it out for different things, which, you know, of course, gets the engineering side of me, you know, very, you know, riled up.